Welcome back, deep divers. We're diving deep today, folks.
That's right. Deep, deep into a topic that's really, kind of fascinating and also super complex. It's this idea of a caste system, but within Black fraternities and sororities.
It's definitely something, right? You think of black fraternities and sororities, and it's all about unity.
Uplift.
Exactly, like lifting each other up, supporting each other.
Yeah.
But are there divisions within these groups based on things like, well, skin tone, how much money your family has, even hair texture? That's what we're going to unpack today.
To do that, we're going to use, we've got this really insightful podcast episode called Shades of Brotherhood.
Shades of Brotherhood.
Yeah. And it features these two hosts, Jamal. He's a historian and an HBCU alumnus, so he knows this world firsthand. And Tasha, who's a cultural critic, and, she's in a sorority herself.
Okay. So they really know what they're talking about here.
They do.
And their discussion is so full of good stuff that we're going to use the same 25 questions they asked as the framework for our own deep dive.
Sounds like a plan.
Let's do it. So first, let's lay down some historical context. When did black fraternities and sororities even pop up in the first place? What were they all about?
Well, so they mostly started forming in the early 1900s.
Early 1900s.
Yeah, like think about it. This was a time when racial segregation, discrimination, it was like the norm in the U.S.
Right.
So these organizations were formed to kind of create this sense of community, right? The support system, a place to belong. For Black students especially who were facing just like massive social and political obstacles.
Yeah, makes sense. I mean, if you're excluded from like every other space.
Exactly. And they were really founded on these principles of achievement too, academically, leadership, serving the community, right?
Yeah, building each other up. So, okay, we've got this incredibly, discriminatory environment. How did that shape the creation of these organizations, you think?
Oh, it's like the very foundation of why they exist. They were a direct response to being shut out, like from white Greek letter societies, from just society in general.
Right.
So they built their own spaces, spaces where Black students could flourish, could nurture their identities, and really like strive for racial progress together. They became like these, really vital institutions for both social and intellectual development.
Okay, but here's a question. Were colorism and classism already an issue within the Black community way back then?
Right.
I mean, did these new organizations inherit any of that baggage?
It's it's a super important question. And, the sad truth is because of slavery and just like the way society was structured, there were distinctions made based on skin color and class, even within the Black community.
Yeah.
And this was, back in the early 20th century.
So it's kind of hard to imagine that those biases wouldn't have, somehow impacted how these organizations took shape.
It's likely, right? It's definitely something historians are still researching and debating. But, even as these groups were fighting against external oppression, they were also dealing with the internal effects of slavery. Like colorism was already there. It's a complex legacy that they had to navigate, whether they were fully aware of it or not.
Absolutely. It's layers upon layers.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's fast forward a bit to the civil rights movement. That was a huge turning point.
Yeah.
How did that movement, that whole era, impact the role and the perception of Black Greek organizations?
Oh, the civil rights movement. It really put them in the spotlight. So many members were on the front lines fighting for equality. They were at protests, sit-ins, the whole 9 yards. And that really cemented their image. It wasn't just about social gatherings anymore. They were seen as powerful forces for change, for, empowering the community.
Yeah.
And their dedication to service, to uplift, it became even more pronounced.
They became like symbols.
Yeah, symbols of Black empowerment.
And what about HBCUs? Historically Black colleges and universities.
Right.
What was their role in all of this?
Oh, they were essential. Like HBCUs were the breeding ground for most of these organizations' early chapters. They provided the environment, the students, the whole context, socially, intellectually for these groups to really take root and like blossom. The culture, the traditions of Black Greek life, they're so intertwined with HBCUs. It's where a lot of the core values and rituals were established.
That makes sense. It's their history.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've got this historical background. Now, let's talk about this controversy, right? This idea of a caste system within Black fraternities and sororities. How did Shades of Brotherhood describe this system? And how does it, supposedly play out in real life today?
So the term caste system in this context, it's basically referring to this perceived hierarchy,
Right.
within and among these organizations. And it's based on stuff like, skin tone, of course. There's this idea that lighter skin is more desirable or that certain groups are associated with certain skin tones. And then socioeconomic status, family connections, even like, hair texture.
Wow.
And the podcast suggests that this shows up today in all these ways, sometimes subtly, sometimes not. It can influence who gets accepted into certain organizations, the social dynamics within them, even the stereotypes people have about different groups.
So there are like actual stereotypes about which organizations are for lighter skin members and which are for darker skin members.
It's really unfortunate, but yeah, those stereotypes exist. Some organizations, maybe because of their history or, who their members are now, get this label of being for lighter skinned people, and others get the opposite label. And it's so damaging, right? Because it reinforces the very thing, colorism, that these organizations should be fighting against.
Right. It's like completely counter to their whole purpose.
It is.
And it's not just about skin tone, though, right?
Yeah.
You mentioned socioeconomic factors, too. How does that tie into perceptions of elitism?
Yeah, so some organizations, maybe because of their background or the perception that their members are wealthy or even just the costs of membership, they get seen as elitist.
Costs of membership.
Yeah, things like dues, social events, that kind of stuff.
Oh, right.
And so some groups might be seen as like attracting people from wealthier families, people with more connections. And that can lead to this feeling of exclusivity, that they're not accessible to students from, less privileged backgrounds.
Yeah, even if those students are super qualified otherwise.
Exactly.
And then there's this idea that some organizations might even prioritize physical appearance during their intake process. That's kind of like wild to think about.
It is, right. And whether it's intentional or not, there's this suggestion that some intake processes put too much emphasis on certain physical characteristics, like things that align with broader societal beauty standards, like lighter skin, certain types of hair, body types.
Right, the things that society tells us are good.
Exactly. And that can make potential members feel like they're being judged on how they look, not on their character or their intelligence or their commitment to the organization's values.
And that must be so damaging, especially for Black students.
Absolutely. It's like, imagine you're already navigating a predominantly white institution, maybe facing other challenges, and then within your own community, within these spaces that are supposed to be supportive, you encounter this. It can make you feel excluded, inadequate, like you don't belong. And that takes a huge emotional toll.
No doubt. Okay, so in Shades of Brotherhood, they also talked about personal experiences. Tasha, as a sorority member, was asked directly if she had experienced or witnessed colorism. What did she say?
Well, the excerpt we have doesn't actually give us a direct quote from Tasha about her own experiences. But the fact that she was asked that question at all, it tells you something. It shows that this is a real concern, that it's something people are aware of within these organizations. And Tasha, being a cultural critic and being open to having this discussion, it kind of implies that she's seen these issues firsthand, even if we don't have the specifics here.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
And what about Jamal? He's an HBCU alumnus. What did he say about divisions in Greek life based on skin tone or class?
Yeah, so Jamal, being an HBCU alumnus, he's seen it firsthand, And as a historian, he's got this deep understanding of these organizations' history. So the fact that he's co-hosting a discussion about this very topic, it tells you that he's likely seen it himself, heard stories about it, and that he thinks it's a serious issue.
Yeah, he even said this topic's been, buzzing around for decades.
Right. It's not new.
So when members of these organizations are confronted with these accusations of colorism or elitism, how do they react? Are they defensive? Or do they acknowledge that there might be a problem?
I imagine it depends on the person. Some might get defensive, right? Maybe they feel like their organization's values contradict these accusations or that they haven't seen it themselves.
Right.
Others might be more open to admitting that these issues exist, maybe point to specific incidents or say it's because of society's influence. We don't have any specific examples of these reactions in the source material, but the way they frame the discussion, it definitely seems like it's a touchy subject, one that can provoke all kinds of responses.
Yeah, for sure. Are there any signs from Shades of Brotherhood that these groups are trying to address these issues internally? Are they doing anything about it?
The part we have doesn't get into specific initiatives, really. But think about it. This podcast episode exists. These hosts are talking about these tough questions openly.
Well.
That's a form of engagement, right? Raising awareness, starting the conversation. And that's always the first step. But whether that translates into actual changes, policies, programs, it's not clear from the source.
Okay, but it's a start.
It's a start.
Right. It's also important to think about how people who aren't in these organizations
Hmm.
perceive them,
Mm-hmm.
How might that affect the overall vibe on campus?
Oh, for sure. It can have a huge impact. If Black Greek organizations are seen as exclusive or, elitist, it can create these social divisions. It can hurt that sense of unity among Black students. It might even make people who aren't in these groups feel resentful or left out.
Hmm.
But, if they're seen as inclusive and as actually uplifting all Black students, then it contributes to a more positive environment. It's a big difference.
For sure. And it's something you see all the time on college campuses.
Absolutely.
Okay, so let's talk about the cultural influence of Black fraternities and sororities. They're such a big part of Black culture.
Hmm.
They influence fashion, music, even social movements. How do they do that?
Oh, their impact is undeniable. Like, Black Creek organizations have this really rich and lasting legacy, and it shows up everywhere.
Mhm.
They have their own styles of dress, they're big into step shows and other forms of art, they're involved in activism. Right.
And, so many important figures in Black culture, artists, politicians, they're members of these organizations.
Yeah.
And that just amplifies their reach and their impact.
So, do these organizations, whether they mean to or not, do they perpetuate societal beauty standards within the Black community? Or do they challenge them?
It's a good question and a tough one. On one hand, their emphasis on unity,
Mm.
on brotherhood and sisterhood, that could be seen as a challenge to those divisive beauty standards.
Right.
But if there's really this caste system based on appearance, then they might be reinforcing those same biases that they should be fighting against.
Yeah, it's complicated.
It's complex.
And then you've got social media. How does that play into all this? Does it make things better, worse, or just more confusing?
Social media it's a double-edged sword. It can amplify these discussions, which is good. It gives people a platform to share their experiences and maybe even hold these organizations accountable.
But it can also distort things. Through misinformation, rumors, echo chambers, things get blown out of proportion, and complex issues get boiled down to these, overly simplistic statements.
Yeah, social media is good at that.
For sure.
Now, despite the criticisms, it's important to remember that these organizations do a lot of good too. Like, they mentor and support Black youth.
Absolutely. That's a huge part of their legacy. They provide role models, academic support, leadership opportunities. They make a real difference in the lives of young people. And sometimes that gets lost in all the talk about internal problems.
Yeah, it's easy to focus on the negative.
Right.
Shades of Brotherhood also talked about how this alleged caste system within Black Greek life is connected to the bigger issue of colorism in the Black community as a whole. What's that all about?
They're basically saying that what might be happening within these organizations, it's not unique to them. It reflects the broader issue of colorism that's been around for so long. The idea that lighter skin is better, that darker skin is somehow less desirable. Right. And if those biases are present within Black Greek life, it's a sign that they haven't escaped those broader societal problems. So in a way, tackling these issues within these organizations could have a ripple effect. It could help challenge colorism in the whole community.
Okay, so looking ahead, what can these organizations do to address these issues head on? How can they make things more inclusive?
Well, I think a big part of it is education. They need to teach their members about colorism and classism, about their history and impact. And they should look at their intake processes, make sure they're not too focused on appearance or socioeconomic factors.
Yeah.
And creating more open forums for discussion, for feedback, that would help too.
Yeah, so people can speak up and feel heard.
Exactly.
And alumni, they often have a lot of influence, right? How can they work with current members to change things?
Alumni are crucial. They bring experience, historical perspective, resources.
Right.
And current members, they're living it right now, so they know what needs to change. So it's about having these open conversations, building bridges between generations.
Collaboration.
Yeah.
What about HBCUs? They seem like they have a big role to play here, too.
Oh, definitely. They're the birthplace of so many of these organizations, so they have a responsibility to promote inclusivity within their Greek life communities. They could host workshops, facilitate discussions, work with the Greek councils to create guidelines that address colorism and elitism directly.
Like set the tone.
Exactly.
Did the podcast mention any specific organizations that are doing things right? Like any success stories we can learn from?
The excerpt we have doesn't highlight any particular examples, but just the fact that they're having this conversation so openly on a public platform, That's a good sign.
Yeah, that's a step.
It shows that people are aware of these issues, and hopefully as these conversations continue, we'll see more examples of positive change that others can follow.
Fingers crossed. So how can the Black community as a whole support these organizations while also holding them accountable? Because it seems like we need both.
Yeah, absolutely. We need to support their good work, acknowledge their positive contributions, but we also need to push them to be better, to live up to their ideals. It's about having these open and honest conversations, offering constructive criticism, holding them to a high standard.
Right, because we want them to succeed.
We do.
This has been a really, really insightful deep dive. I'm glad we had this conversation.
Me too.
Tasha, at the end of Shades of Brotherhood, she talked about how complex these issues are, how important it is to ask these tough questions if we want to grow and be truly united.
Yeah. And Jamal's point about these organizations being a reflection of our community, that really stuck with me. We need to address these internal challenges, so that these organizations can continue to be a source of pride and empowerment for Black people for generations to come.
I agree. And recognizing that there's room for improvement, it doesn't take away from all the good they've done. It's about making sure they continue to have a positive impact.
For everyone.
For everyone, exactly.
So to you, dear listener, we leave you with this thought. How deep do societal biases run? So deep that they can even show up in organizations that were founded on the best of intentions. And what can we each do as individuals to create truly inclusive spaces, not just in Greek life, but everywhere? It's something to think about.
It is.